Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about managed service identities, MSI, and IMDS. Now let's take a quick example of the same web application that we've been talking about. Now in a typical scenario for this particular app service, which say it is a backend, if you are from a developer background, you would see this is a backend, then this is a database, and in one of the servers there'll be a front end hosted, and this is what is exposed to the internet, and you have a backend service and stuff like that. Now backend has to talk to database, right? And it is not unauthenticated, so this has a username and password. And for example, key vault is what stores usernames and passwords or other secrets for that matter, right? There might be API keys that this uses to access external third-party APIs. Now, all of this is done not by storing, the passwords in the source code. Now, one approach of dealing with this scenario is the backend will have source code, right? So in the source code, all the secrets are hard-coded. Now, the problem with hard-coded secrets are a lot. For example, what if someone steals the code? What if the developer who has access to the code gets hacked? Or what if their computer machine gets hacked? Or what if the repo gets hacked? Or what if the server itself gets hacked? This particular credential can be again used to do a lot of other things. Now, frankly, this has been a really, really big problem for a very long time. That is when people started leveraging cloud, or when people started creating what we see today as public clouds. They have created something called as MSI, or also known as managed service identities. Now, this particular concept is pretty much similar to all cloud platforms that you see today, the major ones, which is Azure, AWS, and GCP. Now, what will happen is this particular Azure Web App Service will have a MSI associated to it. Now, consider MSI is just an identity object. It'll be associated to this particular server, and there'll be an MSI associated to this particular key vault. There'll be an MSI associated to this particular database, and there'll be MSI associated to anywhere where they want to access. Now, these MSIs are actually created and stored inside Azure Active Directory. So just like anywhere you create, they basically are stored in your Azure Active Directory. However, when Azure Key Vault wants to talk to app service in an authenticated way, instead of using a username and password, it will simply say, this is my MSI. Let me use this identity to talk to this particular backend service, and every authentication part, like everything which is related to authentication, just happens under the hood. For example, in a very complicated scenario, there'll be storage accounts. There'll be like various blobs where data is stored. Now, this particular backend service will have an MSI, and this MSI is given access to, which is again comes to role-based access control, which we have discussed in the previous video. So this MSI is assigned a role-based access to this particular storage blob, which is say maybe storage contributor. Now this particular MSI can now interact with the storage blob, and it will also be given access to read secrets of from this particular key vault. And this particular MSI will again have access to reading data from a database, or writing data to a database. Now MSIs are so easy, right? I mean, what's the problem now? uh, the advantage of MSI not just resides within Azure. For example, if you are going to use this MSI, and if you want your custom application to just get a MSI as just another identity, right? For example, if you would want to get the access token of this MSI to access a specific resource, for example, in a custom way. So you don't want Azure to do the communication, but you want your custom application to do it. We can do that using something called as IMDS, which is Instance Metadata Service. Now, IMDS itself was not just created to access MSI access tokens, but it is also one of the features of IMDS that it will return an access token for an MSI. Now, before we get into IMDS, there are some quick things that we need to talk about the MSI. Now, let me just go into the Azure portal and let me quickly show you what I mean when I say MSI. Now, I'm going to a virtual machine, and on the left-hand corner, you see something called as identity. When you go to identity, you have two different identity types, which is a system assigned identity and user assigned identity. Now, typically, if we go back to our example here, we can either use the default identity that this particular app service might have, and we can assign privilege to one key vault, to logical server, to database, and stuff like that, or and to the storage account. Or what we could do is we could create our own managed identity and we could attach this particular identity to this particular app service. Now, what is the advantage of doing this is tomorrow if I've created a new website or a new application, or if I'm using this in scaling mode, like if I use auto scaling and or if I'm using Kubernetes nodes and stuff like that, I can attach the same MSI to all the specific resources that I am creating, and the privileges just work out of the box. Now, if you go here, by default, there is the system assigned managed identity is not turned on. For specific services like automation accounts in Azure, it is turned on by default, but for some, it is not turned on. Now, to add a user assigned managed identity, you can just go to add and you can select any managed identity that you already have. But assuming that you do not have a managed identity yet, we will see how we can create a managed identity. Now we can go here and type in managed identities and you can click on create, and you will have an option to, you can just say this, I want to say test, YouTube, video, and I'll click on review and create, and I can create a managed identity now. Now, this particular managed identity can be used, can be attached to this particular VM or any other resource for that matter. Now, I can go here, I can go to identity, I can go to user assigned identity, click on add, and I can search for this. It should be test YouTube video, and I'll add this. Now, what is the privilege that this particular identity that I've just created has? By default, just like any other identity object, it does not have any user. But you can go to this particular, you can click on this particular identity and you can go to Azure role assignments and you can give the role assignments just the way we were doing it, right? For example, you can give there are two keywords. I'll go and I'll select owner. I'll make this owner of a keyword, and I can just, so this happens two-way, right? Like you can either do it from here or you can go to the resource and you can add role assignments directly. Now, if you wait for a second, you would quickly see the role that we have just added popping up. We can also add multiple okay, wait. Now, typically you can go into a managed identity and you can add role assignments by using this particular option by selecting the subscription. You can give it at a subscription level or you can give it at a resource group level, keyword, storage, or SQL. And it's pretty much the same concepts that we have discussed in RBAC applies here as well. But I would love to actually do it a different way. Now I can go to a keyword and I would want to give it from here because this gives me more fine-grained access. I'll simply go, I'll click on add role assignment. I'll make this a reader. I'll select managed identity. I'll select the members. I will select a user assigned managed identity. I can select YouTube, okay, and I'll click on select and I'll assign this particular identity. Now, if I attach this, so the one which I've attached to my virtual machine here, so this use case is something where my any process on my particular virtual machine wants to access Key Vault, that I've just added my role assignment to. Now, assuming that you've got the concept of MSI very clear, let's quickly hop on to IMDS. Now, IMDS, as I've just mentioned, is a really interesting concept. Now, IMDS was, as I've told you, was initially created to get information about current processes, virtual machines, and other information. Now, here's a very beautiful documentation that briefly describes about what IMDS is and what is the usage of IMDS and stuff like that. Now, I have my virtual machine open and I'll quickly see what I can do with this IMDS, right? So I quickly entered the command that is intended to access IMDS metadata service, and this is going to give me some basic information about this particular instance. Now, if I go here, it is giving me what environment this is a part of, what is the offer, basically what is the provider, resource ID, and other information like what is the SKU, OS image, and stuff like that. Now, interesting enough, there are multiple endpoints in IMDS which is present in this public documentation. Now, if you go to endpoint categories, you see there is attested, there is identity, instance, load balancer, scheduled events, and versions. Now, we are mostly interested in this managed identity via IMDS because this is the endpoint that gives you the token when you request for it. Now, when you go to this particular documentation and click on access token, you have a way in which get a token using curl. Now, remember I was telling you that, hey, it's not just a user or it's not just someone getting access to it. It's a process that can get access to a token. Now, what would typically be a use case where a process would get access to a token? Now, process, let's say there is a custom program that you have created, which is going to access Key Vault, get some secrets, and is going to do some actions. Probably just insert some documents into the blob. So instead of storing the secrets inside this custom application or anywhere on the machine, dynamically you will be able to send a request to IMDS endpoints and fetch the token. For example, when you click on this, you get a curl request. Now let me go to my terminal. Let me and I get the token, right? So I copy this token, which is a typical JWT token. If you see the pattern, and I go to jwt.ms, which is a free utility where you could inspect JWT tokens, or you could use jwt.io or CyberChef or anything that works for you. Now, in this particular token, I've just pasted this and I get a decoded token. So in this typically you see a lot of parameters, which is audience and ISS and NBF, EXP, etc., etc. Now, if you would want to get a clear information about what this token is and what are its scopes and what is its audience and stuff like that, you can go to claims and you would have a very clear information about what this token is who this token is intended for and what is the validity of this token and other details. I quickly walk you through this, but we will be talking about this more about in the in the Azure AD part of it. So I'll not be spending too much time on it. But just as a refresher, the audience is basically it basically signifies who this token is sort of addressed to. In this case, since we have given the if you see the example, it says the resource equal to https management.azure.com. So this token can be used on management.azure.com. The ISS is basically the security token service, which is basically who issued this token. Now it is by default sts.windows.net slash your tenant ID. Like you can just check inside your Azure AD, you will find this as your tenant ID. Now IAT is when the token was issued, NBF is where the token is not supported, and EXP is when the token is not basically it is expired. And AIO is something that is internal to Microsoft, which is basically used for not basically used to avoid token reuse. It's not something that we'll have to care about. Now, App ID is basically a service principal object that is created in Azure AD on behalf of your service principal. Now, if you go and search for this on Azure AD, you will find that this particular MSI was actually created as an enterprise application, which is basically a service principal inside Azure AD. Now, the same, the properties of our managed identity are replicated as a service principal. So this is our object of service principal in our Azure AD. Now, IDP is basically what is our identity provider, which in this case is generally the who issued the token, which is the issued SDS. And object ID is the unique ID of this particular managed identity in Azure AD. And tenant ID is your the unique identifier of your tenant. And these two are very important, right? So the XMS underscore AZ underscore RID is the resource of this particular of this particular generated MSI, sorry, the resource from which the MSI was generated, and XMS MIR ID is the exact resource ID or the ARM ID of the managed service identity that we have here. So what you could do as an attacker, probably you must be already thinking that, hey, what can I do as an attacker? Figuring out with IMDS and MSI, a lot of jargons here, right? Now, just assume, if we go to our example here, let's just assume that you've got access to one of the edge servers here, right? So if you have access to this particular MSI, if you have a RCE or if you have SSRF, currently SSRF is mitigated by adding another token, which is beyond the scope of this playlist. But basically, using these attacks, you could query IMDS, not SSRF right now, but you could use RCE or you could use say a malicious application inside the system to query to see if the MSI is present to this particular virtual machine which you've got access to. You could use the MSI associated to this to pivot to multiple other machines. For example, this token you can replay and you can access management.azure.com, the token that we have just generated. We can use it to manipulate or to manage Azure management.azure.com. Now, for example, if this particular user, which we have just seen here today, right, like this Apache admin, if this has any Azure assignments, for example, if this Azure role assignments are currently this doesn't have any Azure role assignments, but let's just say this is owner of a subscription, or this is some privileged user, then this becomes a super big problem. As a defender, it is important that you understand, identify privileged MSIs in your environment, and we will try to see if we can see some KQL queries to see how we can identify that. But from an attacker perspective, you know what to do. You find MSIs which are over provisioned or which have high number of privileges, and then use it against those services.